Hi there, my name is Hannah, otherwise known as Mick, and welcome to Mick Makes. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a book cover in two different styles. The first is the standard or the flat style, and the second is the boxy style. If you'd like to have access to the downloadable PDF, it'll be in the link below. To get started, we're going to measure your book to determine which book cover pattern is the best fit for you. We're going to be measuring the length, as well as the width, and the thickness or the height of your book. With these dimensions, we can see if any of the given patterns fit your needs or whether you'll have to make a custom pattern. These are my dimensions below, and as you can see, the height is 2.5 centimeters, so it's quite flat. So I'll be picking from the standard patterns, and I'll be picking standard B because that is the dimensions that better fit my book. If your book is quite thick, I would have a look at the boxy patterns instead. Once you've printed all of your pattern piece pages and checked that the scale is 1 centimeter on the first page, we can go ahead and attach them all together. We're going to place A1 on a flat surface and then take A2 and cut off the left side. You can see that there's a slight border around all the pages, and we want all the pages to match up really nicely. So we're going to cut off that left hand side border and match up the triangles on A1 and A2 so they make a full diamond shape. Line up all the other lines and then you can tape in place. We're going to repeat this for the rest of the row, cutting off the left side and then taping it to the previous page. We can then move on to the second row or row B. We're going to cut off the top border of the first page, B1, and then tape it to A1, matching up those edges as well as the triangles to make a full diamond. For the rest of row B, we're going to cut off the top as well as the left and then tape it to the previous page. You can cut out your tie and the main body piece that suits you. If the dimensions of your book don't fit any of the downloadable patterns, I'm going to show you how to make your own one. We can start by taping a bunch of printer paper together to make a bigger piece, placing your book down flat, and we can draw an outline. If you want to make a standard custom pattern for a flatter book, we can start by making a 3 centimeter border around the outline, and then checking the corners with a 90-degree angle just to make sure everything's 90 degrees. If your book is thicker than 4 centimeters, I would recommend the boxy type or the boxy style. We're going to start with an outline and then moving on to the border on the top. We're going to do 2 centimeters on the top edge, and then on the rest of the sides we're going to do a 3.5 centimeter border, and then finishing off the bottom corners with a 2 by 2 centimeter box. You can then check the corners with a 90-degree ruler and cut out your pattern pieces. Moving on to cutting your fabric, I'm going to fold my fabric in half, but you can also choose to cut out your fabric pieces separately. I'm going to pin my chosen pattern piece to my fabric and then cut around the pattern piece about 1 or 2 centimeters bigger than the pattern piece itself. This is to accommodate the quilting process. And for the purpose of demonstration, I will also be doing a boxy style. I've chosen boxy A. I'm going to pin it to the fabric and then cut it out about 1 or 2 centimeters bigger than the actual pattern piece. I'm going to leave the squares for now. I'm not going to cut those out. We can do that at a later stage. I'm also going to be cutting out the lining for each of the styles, cutting them out true to size this time, and for the boxy, cutting out the corners. I'm also going to be cutting out the ties for each style. I'm going to be folding the fabric in half, cutting out 2 ties, and then I'll flip the tie pattern over and repeat the process so that I have 4 in total, with 2 mirrored pairs. So whether you made your own pattern or chose one of mine, you should have 2 outer pieces, 2 lining pieces, and 4 tie pieces with 2 mirrored pairs. For this step, I will be demonstrating with both the standard style and the boxy style, but you will just need your 2 pieces of outside fabric cut bigger than the pattern piece. I'll be using a pencil and a ruler to draw lines on my fabric in any configuration. I like to do a crisscross style. Once you're done with that, you can pin the outside fabric pieces onto your wadding or batting, using it as many pins as you like if you are a beginner. You can stitch over the pencil lines that you've just created with a stitch length of about 2 or 3 so that the stitches don't unravel throughout the project. It might also help to place a hand on either side of the pressure foot to give you a little bit more control throughout the quilting process. Once you've completed quilting both pieces, you can pin the pattern piece back onto the outer fabric and then cut both outer pieces true to size. If you chose the boxy style, we're going to do the same process. We're going to pin the main pattern piece onto the outer quilted fabric and then cut it out true to size, not forgetting to cut out the small boxes in the bottom corners. We're going to begin with the standard style construction, starting by placing those outer quilted body pieces on top of one another, right sides facing, making sure all the corners and edges are lined up, and then pinning into place. We're going to repeat this process for the lining, placing them on top of one another with the right sides facing, and then pinning in place. We're going to stitch around the perimeter of the outer fabric with a 1 cm seam allowance, and the same for the lining, but leaving a small gap in the bottom of the lining. Be sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end for both of these sections. Turn your outer section inside out and use your fingers to push out all the corners and seams. We're then going to fold the outside section in half and then mark that midpoint on the top edge with a pin. We're going to flip it over and repeat the same thing on the other side. We can then move on to constructing the tie. I'm going to pin the pairs together right sides facing and then stitch around the perimeter of both ties with a 1 cm seam allowance, leaving the bottom open, not forgetting to reverse stitch at the beginning and the end. I'm also going to cut off some bulk around the corners so that those edges are nice and crisp when we turn the tie inside out. To turn your tie inside out, I'm going to push the pointed edge into the middle of the tube shape that we made, and then use a pair of scissors to push it all the way through. You can also use a pointed object or a pair of scissors to push out all of the corners and the angles, as well as the seams, to make everything nice and crisp. Once you've turned out both ties, you can give them both an iron. You're then going to fold the raw edges of the bottom of each tie and mark the midpoint with a pin. With our first tie, we're going to match up the midpoint of the tie on the midpoint of the outside of the cover and then re-pin in place so that it's nicely in the middle. You can flip the cover over and then repeat the same thing on the other side, making sure that the points of both ties are pointing in the same direction. Sew in place with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. We're going to take our lining over to the ironing board and flip the raw edges of the gap upwards and give them a good iron. This is so that the raw edges will disappear into the middle of the lining when we turn everything inside out at the end of the project. You can flip the lining over and repeat on the other side. Next, we're going to roll up the ties and pin them loosely in place, not too high. This is just to keep them out the way throughout the rest of the project. For the next step, we're going to place the outside section into the lining. The lining should still be wrong sides facing out, and the outside section is still right sides facing out. Both of these sections have matching side seams, so we want to match those seams up, put them on top of one another, and then pin in place. Repeat this on the other side, match up the seams, and then pin them in place. And then you can pin the outer section and the lining together around the perimeter of the opening. You're then going to sew around the whole perimeter of the opening with a 1 cm seam allowance. Next, you're going to pull the outer fabric through the gap in the lining and use your fingers to push out all the seams and corners in both the lining and the outer fabric. Next, we're going to secure that gap in the lining by pinching either side of the gap with your middle finger and thumb, and then using your index finger to push all of the raw edges into the middle of the lining. We're going to pin that all in place, making sure that none of the raw edges are visible from the outside, and then you can secure that gap with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. You can then unpin your ties and unravel them. And for the next step, we're going to push our lining into the cover. And as you can see, the cover is starting to take shape now, but there's nothing stopping the lining from coming out. So we want to roll that top edge in between our thumb and our index finger, making sure the lining isn't visible, and then pinning that in place. You want to repeat this around the whole circumference of the opening, making sure the tie is flipped up and not touching the outside fabric, otherwise it'll get caught in seams. We can then sew along the top edge of the opening again with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And as you can see in this video here, the tie is flipped up and is not touching the outside fabric, so it won't be getting caught in that seam. And you've completed your book in the standard style. Next, we're going to move on to the boxy style. We're going to place those quilted pieces on top of one another, right sides facing, and make sure all the edges and the corners are lined up, and we're going to pin that in place. And we can repeat this for the lining, putting them on top of one another with the right sides facing, lining up all the edges, and then pinning in place. We're then going to stitch the sides and the bottom of the outer section, leaving the top open, as well as the lining, except we will be leaving a small gap in the bottom of the lining and not forgetting to reverse stitch at the beginning and the end for both pieces. Next, we're going to take our lining over to the ironing board and flip up the raw edges of the gap and iron them upwards. This is to make sure that the raw edges will be on the inside of the lining when we finish the project. You can flip it over and repeat that on the other side. Next, we're going to create the boxy shape in both the outside piece and the lining. We're going to join the seam on the side to the seam on the bottom and then pull out those corner pieces so that they're nice and flat. You can then pin in place. We're going to repeat this on the other side of the outside piece, as well as both corners in the lining. You're going to sew over that little edge that we created and sew over both the side seam and the bottom seam. Next, we're going to create the ties. If you want more information on this, there is a whole breakdown in the standard style section of this video. We're then going to turn our outer section inside out and push out all of the corners and the seams. We're then going to fold our outer section in half and then mark the midpoint on the top edge by the opening with a pin on both sides. We are then going to take our ties and fold the raw edges at the bottom in half and mark that midpoint with a pin as well. You're then going to match up the midpoint with your first tie to the midpoint of one of the sides on the outside section, secure in place, flip over and then repeat on the other side, making sure that both of those points of the ties are going in the same direction. You can then secure with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, and then we're going to roll up those ties, not too high, and then secure in place with a pin. This is just to keep them out the way for the rest of the project. You are then going to put your outside section into your lining. Your lining is still wrong sides facing out, and your outer section is right sides facing out. And you'll notice that they have matching side seams on both sides. You're going to place those side seams on top of one another, matching them up nicely and then pinning in place. And then you can carry on pinning around the perimeter of the opening. You're then going to sew around the top edge or the perimeter of the opening with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then pull that outside section through the hole in the lining and make sure to push all the seams and the corners out with your fingers. To seal the lining, we're going to pinch either side of the gap with your thumb and middle finger, and then push the raw edges into the center of the lining with your index finger, making sure none of the raw edges are visible from the outside, and then pinning in place and securing with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. You're going to push the lining into your cover and roll the top edge of that opening in between your thumb and forefinger. You want to pin that in place, making sure only the outside fabric is visible. The lining should be all the way on the inside. You want to flip your tie up as well and make sure that it's not touching the outside fabric. We are then going to sew along the top edge all the way around with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and as you can see here, the tie is flipped up. And congratulations, you've finished your boxy style cover.